Today, we're looking at a Barbarian build that is simultaneously one of my favorites to run just for fun, and also one of those where I find the meta version annoying as hell. This build, as you can tell from the footage, is the Throwbarb, and to be fair, I'll be showing off both the meta version as well as the version I prefer to run throughout the video. Now, the meta version uses a fairly similar setup to what I enjoy, but includes one weapon that drives me crazy: the Lacerator, which is easily one of the best weapons for killing bosses, uniques, and champions, but is irritating when you're doing full clears because despite having a 33% chance to cast amplify damage, it also has a 50% chance to cause monsters to flee, which, you guessed it, overrides the amplify damage. So, if all you're doing is boss hunting, going with that will be a lot faster since they cannot be hit with fear effects. But when clearing out normal enemies for item-based farming and such, it requires a lot more attention, since the enemies will run away and scatter in various directions, which does not work for me in areas with physical immunes due to the inconsistency, and also since I like doing my grinding while either listening to podcasts, doing some language practice, or any other number of tasks, having to focus even more on who is amped and who is feared is kind of annoying. So I need something that's a bit more fire and forget, and just in general more enjoyable. So instead, I treat the Barbarian more in line with a Bladeson or a Strafezon, and go instead for generally strong weapons with good mods and a Mercenary that supports that, rather than specifically the Boss Hunter setup that is super popular. Though one nice thing is, you actually can somewhat cheese an easy alternative to the Lacerator ever since 2.4 launched. Though before we get into that, let's knock out the core skills for this build since there are only 3 core skills, and a handful of 1-point wonders of course. Meaning we have a lot of flexibility to get into, since that's only 60 to 70 points, and you get 110 points if you hit level 99. Starting with the most obvious since it's part of the name of the build, and that's the throwing skill, Double Throw. This is the skill that will pretty much permanently be on your left click throughout the game since it is your primary attack skill. It boosts damage and attack rating as you would expect, and gets a synergy from Double Swing above that we use to boost the damage effect even further. In terms of 1-point wonders in this tree, there's pretty much 2 common choices. Frenzy is able to get your massive boost to attack speed and run walk speed if you want it, and a super handy tool for more active playstyles of this build since you can toggle between it and your double throw to keep zipping along at maximum speed without a care in the world, and can be used to bypass the need for a Faithbow Mercenary for some weapon variants. The other 1-point wonder option here, and one that I recommend getting if you're not going to be running Enigma on this build, which most people won't be until post-game, if even then, is Leap Attack. It's a fun skill in general, and in 2.4 it got an area of effect function that makes it semi-fun to play around with as a focus, though not really important for this build other than mobility. The reason we take Leap Attack instead of Leap though is just the range of it, since Leap Attack is not range limited and can go all the way to the edge of the screen. Though it is worth noting, it feels a little less free than it did in Lord of Destruction, so you'll hear "I can't do that" a bit more, but it's still a solid mobility tool. Now, the other primary skill is not in this tree, but rather over here in the Mastery tree, along with 2 more points in, well, 1-point wonders. But the most important skill, and the one I max out first on a Throw Barbarian as I play, is Throwing Mastery. This is because it's not only improving the damage and attack rating, but it also includes a crit chance, a pierce effect, and a replenishing function for your weapons, making them a lot more reliable. Now, before it's mentioned, no, don't bother with the Blade Mastery, Axe Mastery, or Spear Mastery unless you are using your weapons in melee. This is because Throw applies to all throws, and the other masteries only apply to melee attacks. As far as the 1-point wonders, Natural Resistance is the most important of the 2 since who doesn't want free resists, and it functions quite well for that. And the other lesser importance but still super handy one is Increased Speed, which lets you zip around areas much quicker than you otherwise would. It is worth noting that if you are doing a hybrid Frenzy throw build, then you might want to invest in increased stamina to make that Frenzy duration a little longer, though it is only a very tiny improvement and very low priority. The last tree is the Warcry tree, with the usual shout, battle command, and battle orders being something Barbarians almost always pick up. Usually when I'm being lazy, I don't cast them very often since I'd rather just keep attacking and moving, and I rarely die anyways. but when you're going into a tough battle, they are nice to have for a little extra buffer on your life. Now, there are other useful skills in here for the Throwbarb, with Battle Cry being okay if you're low on attack rating and don't have any other support skills you can bring to bear, such as when you're doing solo self-found, but I generally find having an Act 1 mercenary with Inner Sight works better for me since I don't have to get in so close. The other skill that can be handy in this tree is Grim Ward, which is weirdly one of the tools that makes it harder for me to justify Lacerator for general farming, since it does the same job against trash mobs without the layers of overriding curses. Now, it does have one big drawback. It does not work on bosses, uniques, or champions, since the resist penetration is based around the fear curse it causes, which I have made whole videos talking about before. So mileage will be limited to a very specific group. That said, if you do use it, remember Find Potion is the skill that determines the minus physical resist, not Grim Ward itself. The ward only impacts radius and slow effects. Now, that was a lot of options. With endgame gear, my personal preference is just to go battle orders, sadly, so it lasts longer. Or if I'm wanting more stuff, go find item instead. There really isn't a need to be using a lot of these side abilities if you're playing in a chill fashion, and if you're boss hunting, you're going Enigma and teleporting to them, same for if you're rushing people. Now, in terms of going through solo self-found, javelins, throwing axes, and throwing knives are actually not that hard to come by, but they do have the disadvantage of not being able to get rune words, so you're going to be constantly hunting for the next big find, and generally will be using subpar weapons if you don't have anything to transfer in, so it's not entirely for the faint of heart. That said, this is one of those odd builds that can benefit somewhat from using crafting recipes, such as the ruby-based blood crafting that works on throwing axes, but can also be used to get you crushing blow with gloves, bleed with belts, and deadly strike on helmets. They can be semi-useful for this, and if you're wanting javelins instead, the emerald-based safety recipes can be handy for that weapon itself too. Though, since it is a fairly complicated subject, I'm going to just give you a link to the Ariat Summit page for these various item groups, where it explains the mechanics and the guaranteed modifiers on them, so you can kind of sort through and decide what you want. As far as the order I do things in, enough strength and dexterity for my gear as I go along, and the rest into vitality. And in terms of skills, I generally get my 1-point wonders as I go along and base points into various skills as they become available, but I max out throwing mastery as my main focus just to save on trips to town if nothing else. And then I invest in double throw itself for attack rating boost, and by the time you get the two done, you'll usually be in Nightmare and feeling the sadly lower early stages of, well, the Barbarian slogging through stuff. Though, as you start investing in double swing to boost your damage and slowly upgrading your gear, if even just by shopping from merchants, you will start to feel your power finally at least being semi-competitive. And by the time you've done this in Nightmare, you'll be at the point where you can decide how you want to invest all your spare points, which, for solo self-found, I would generally lean towards the Grim Ward choice since it just gives us a lot more tools to deal with the enemies and control or kill them. Though, if you find yourself really struggling in hell, don't be afraid to use Howl as well. It will give you the breathing room you need in a pinch. There aren't really super easy to farm items that will help out a ton with this solo self-found. If you're having trouble hitting, use an Act 1 Mercenary for Inner Sight. If you're having trouble dealing enough damage, use an Act 2 Might Mercenary instead. And for the most part, it will just be your standard kind of steady-paced Barbarian walk through the difficulties. There is a reason they tend to fall in the tail end of speedrunning leaderboards, of course. This is basically because they are very equipment-based, and without rune words, there is a lot less smoothing opportunities short of getting specific uniques and set items, or maybe some lucky rares. Now, in terms of endgame gear, there are GG options, like jeweler's gear with perfect jewels of some such, and also there's various kind of rare and crafted javelins that would be broken almost. Though, for something more in the realm of what you're aiming for as something you actually can farm, even as a single player, we have something a bit more straightforward. But let's knock the weapons out of the way first. There's a lot of good ones, but the three worth highlighting are Lacerator, Warstrike, and Gimmershred. Dual Gimmershreds are a super cheap weapon to keep on swap for physical immunes if you, like me, don't like Lacerator, and you just want something that will punch out a decent amount of elemental damage for ghosts and such. While great for lower player counts, this sadly will not scale to higher counts, but it is still a fun weapon to swap and useful for its purpose. Speaking of Lacerator though, that is the one that actually scales well, and is actually best in slot for a peak build, but it has the annoying conflicting curse thing going on like we mentioned earlier. so unless I'm specifically boss hunting, I tend to skip it. And it is worth noting, even in the meta build, you only use one of these, and you pair it with our third weapon in this list, Warstrike. And this is, funnily enough, the weapon I enjoy the most out of the three, and one that may look rather mundane at first glance, but actually has a lot of fun perks, such as 50% Pierce, which when combined with your Mastery pretty much negates the need for things like Razortail, has a decent attack speed and okay damage, but you can add a decent chunk to that thanks to the 50% Deadly Strike, especially since you already have a decent chance of Critical Strike from Mastery 2, meaning most your hits will actually deal double the listed damage. Obviously, you want ethereal of these last two if you can get them, just for the extra damage, but if you can't, they're still just fine as like physical weapons. And even with Gimmer Shreds, you usually won't run out of them with this build thanks to the mastery effects of basically keeping it topped off constantly, despite those not having replenished quantity like our physical options. As far as the speed of these, they're unfortunately all different, so you will want to use an attack speed calculator to figure out just how much you need in addition to your gear. For that, there is also a link down in the description, and you can use it to calculate what you need if you're using a Faith Mercenary as well as if you aren't, so you can actually switch through the various options and kind of figure out exactly how to tune your build to your wants and needs. That said, as long as you get a reasonable amount, you'll be fine. You can always use Frenzy to cover the gaps. That said, I did go with a few sources of attack speed, such as Andariel's Visage, with an increased attack speed jewel, of course. It's not as strong as things like the Jeweler's Diadems of whatever, but it is a lot more accessible for offline play. But there are a number of socketed helms you can use to get to just between 15 and 45% increased attack speed with Fervor Jewels, which are a bit more common. A cheap option here is to actually socket a G-Face to get your Deadly Strike if you want it, and a little attack speed with the right jewel. In terms of the rest of our attack speed, we have High Lord's Wrath as a kind of go-to amulet for this, and while Cat's Eye is nice for mobility, I prefer the plus skills, lightning resist, and having this cover my Deadly Strike instead of using my helmet for it, basically just guaranteeing a double damage hit. And to round out the speed, we use Laying of Hands with another 20% increased attack speed, and a damage to demon boost that's pretty handy as well. The Holy Bolt is also oddly helpful for some enemies, but it's still only a minor extra bit of damage, and you will need other support skills for it. As far as the rest of our gear, some guides will have you use Enigma so you can hit the bosses quick and be on your way, and that is the build you will use the Lacerator on. But personally, I'm going with Fortitude here for the extra damage boost, and a few other handy mods for the build as well. It's an all-around just good armor for us. But you could use more budget items like Duriel's Shell or the Runeward Duress for some solid mods as well for much cheaper. On the rings, it's usually just some form of Mana Leech if you don't have it elsewhere, some resists, and probably most importantly Ravenfrost, since it gives you dexterity, attack rating, and cannot be frozen. Though it does have a mild drawback that the cold damage can sometimes cause corpses to shatter, so if you're going to hork corpses, you may want to swap it out for a resist ring and instead use Trangul's or Duriel's Shell for the cannot be frozen effect. Though since I'm not horking, I went with Razortail on the belt just to boost pierces with Gimmer Shred on the swap, as well as provide a bit of extra damage. But pretty much any endgame belt will work just fine, and it's a very flexible slot for the build depending on your needs. So if you're sticking with just War Strikes, don't be afraid to toss in a T-Gods, a String of Ears, or any number of other utility belts to round it out. You can even source your Mana Leech here if you want to, and have free reign to do whatever you want in your rings. Similarly, the boots are extremely flexible. I'm just using War Travelers here for a bit of extra damage, but if you need bleed, you can go Gore Riders. If you want more life or resist, there's a plethora of boots for them as well. This is because outside of attack speed and spots you can cram extra percent enhanced damage into, this build is extremely easy to mix and match gear onto. So don't be afraid to mess around with it. It won't hurt you a ton as long as you hit your target breakpoints. Charm-wise, just like with most martial classes, don't ever bother with plus skill charms on this build. You want to go entirely plus maximum damage and plus attack rating charms. Of course, in addition to the Torch and Annie that most people will be carrying in the endgame. For the Mercenary with the Warstrike version, I just go Reaper's Toll Might Mercenary to give us that Decrepify fairly reliably and provide a tool to hold enemies in place, though if you're needing to max out attack speed and are deciding to use Lacerator, you cannot beat the Fanaticism Act 1 Mercenary since she boosts your attack speed and provides extra fire support and elemental damage. Overall, while not super friendly for starting out from scratch, it is one of the better Barbarian builds out there as you near the end game. falling into the top 5 variants fairly easily due to being able to be optimized for both boss hunting as well as full clears. And it is actually a ton of fun to play with whenever you're just wanting something that is slightly less common to see floating around online, but that is still functional for the class and relaxing to play. If you want something even more relaxing to play but isn't hooked up to the Barbarian flavor, check out the video on screen now for what's my go-to build for farming while I'm working on other projects. And a special thanks to the channel members and patrons that make this content possible.